On behalf of the Institute of Politics and the Student Advisory Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our continuing series on the 1992 Democratic presidential nomination. Our guest tonight has shown his commitment to public service through his involvement in such organizations as the Peace Corps and the Massachusetts Board of Regents of Higher Education. He has served at all levels of government, from the Lowell, Massachusetts City Council to his position as Middlesex County Commissioner to the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. He is a man of commitment and courage, most notably to be the first person to announce for the candidacy for the president. Please welcome Senator Paul Tsongas.
Thank you very much. Good sound system. My voice thanks you. The last time I spoke here, I had a cold. There is something about this school that is hazardous to my health. And I think having been a JFK school dropout has something to do with it. I'm going to speak softly, but hopefully carry a reasonable stick in terms of substance, and going to try to leave as much time as possible for you to ask questions. Those of us who have been in politics are often accused of being full of it. Well, tonight that's true, but it's Robitussin that I'm with codeine, so if you hear something particularly irrelevant or irrational, that's my excuse early on before it gets worse. Anyway, I apologize for the last time I did this. It was the first question I got from the audience was in reference to my having been through a cancer experience, that how could I run for president if I sounded the way I did. I made the point that having a cold is not un-American, and so you might keep that in mind as we go through this. I'd like to make a prediction tonight, and that is very simply that the party which wins the presidential race in 1992 will be the party of economic hope. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that ultimately what people are going to vote for is the candidate and the party that can offer hope out of what is now obviously beginning to be recognized as an economic decline that this country has never experienced unless you go back for several decades. Before I suggest what the basis of economic hope is, let me go back and talk about the issue of our parties and where we are as Democrats and Republicans and what I think are the larger issues that we're faced with. The average person in this country today is fearful. You know, I began this race back in March, and at that point George Bush was at 91%. And when I spoke here a couple of weeks later, he was at 91%. And people said, why would you possibly run for president against someone who was unbeatable? And my response was that I never run against anybody who's less than 85%. It's just not worth the challenge. And the president has gone from 91 to 55%. I think I've done a hell of a job. If I stay in this race, at this rate, 4 months from now, they're going to have to substitute Dan Quayle. That'll take about 3 weeks. The reason I got into this race, you remember now, I'm a private citizen. I've been out for 7 years. I have no capacity, as most politicians do, to raise money out of an office. As my finance chair will often tell me, he said, "Paul, you can't even get people Red Sox tickets, let alone..." And that's when they were valuable. So why do it? The reason I've decided to do this back 8 months ago was that I live in the private sector. I'm a lawyer. I feel like I should do a mea culpa when I say that. I'm a developer, and shows you what good business sense I have to get into Massachusetts real estate in the late 1980s. I'm also director of 7 companies. So I've spent these 7 years dealing with and being exposed to the economy of the United States. The companies on whose boards I serve are major multi-billion-dollar companies like Wang Laboratories or Boston Edison or Sharma Bank, down to small startups that no one ever heard of. So I've experienced it on the broad level. The fact is, the United States is not competing. And the inevitable result of that reality is economic decline and the decline of the American standard of living. That is a fact. And those of us who, and those of you who live in the private sector, what I'm saying is not particularly interesting because it's a given. And the people in the private sector cannot understand why the people in the public sector don't understand this basic reality. My own view, and I spent the last week or so at home trying to get rid of this cold, is that what we're going to go through in this country in the next year or two is a self-analysis, a self-examination, and to get to some very basic questions about who we are and what we're worth and what our capacity is as a country, not as taxpayers but as citizens, and whether we as a culture and a country have what it takes to reverse the current direction we're going in. I said earlier at dinner that one of the books I've read this last week when I was trying to recover was Willa Cather's book, Oh Pioneers, that talked about the early pioneers who went to Nebraska and what they went through to survive. And part of why I raised that is I spent a lot of time these last few months thinking about my own ancestors and what they went through to come to this country and the hardships they endured. And I look out at you all, and every one of you has a similar story. That somewhere along the line, somebody endured enormous hardship and sacrifice and showed incredible will that allowed you to be here tonight. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, are you as strong as those whose blood is in your veins? Are we worthy of those who gave us this country? That's the question that I think this campaign is about. It's not about Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or liberals. It's a question of what are Americans about in 1992. What is our capacity for sacrifice? Our capacity for something greater than just ourselves. You know, are we the descendants of Thomas Jefferson? Are we the descendants of Boesky? Which are we? And what is the proportion in that answer? I believe that politics is a matter of will, and government is a matter of will, and societies are a matter of will, and what the culture is that binds us together. And that is ultimately what this debate is about. Now let me try to discuss strategy from a philosophical point of view. I guess we don't have a blackboard. So I'm going to try to sketch this out with a weak voice, but I think you'll get the point. Let me ask a theoretical question. What is George Bush's view of the American people? If you think about George Bush and his policies, eventually, if you study them long enough, you will arrive at a view, this man's view of his country and his fellow countrymen and countrywomen. You can say that about any politician. What is George Bush's view of the American public? There are basically two ways to govern. One way is called divide and rule. You simply take your entity, whether it's a democracy or a totalitarian regime, and you divide it. And those that you divide make up more than 50%. You identify with them against the other group. They vote for you, and you win. That is standard politics. Now, give me an example. During the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon was able to get the support of the so-called hard hats because they were able to divide the country. The country was divided anyway, and he identified that group with his policies, and they came to him. Richard Nixon and the hard hats. That is the most unlikely combination in history. Can you imagine Richard Nixon, when he wasn't running for president, going to any place where there were hard hats voluntarily? No. I mean, you got a flat tire and had to get somebody to help him change the tire, then he would go. There was no natural affinity between Richard Nixon and the hard hats. This guy was uncomfortable with anybody, let alone with hard hats. I mean, walk on the beach with wingtips. A fire in the middle of the summer with the air conditioning on, that is not typical hard hat behavior. But they voted for him. They voted for him. And that's what counts. He understood divide and rule. I mean, Spiro Agnew was not an accident. Spiro Agnew's policies were a very clever, premeditated, effective use of divide and rule. And it worked. It always is painful for someone like me to talk about Spiro Agnew, because I'm Greek American. And one of the classic stories in my home city of Lowell was that Spiro Agnew came to Lowell. And this was in 1974 to do a fundraiser for the congressman I later defeated. And I was a student here at the time. And the Greek community, which loved Spiro Agnew, came to my house to ask me not to picket him. I wasn't going to, but it was a hell of an idea. Anyway, there was a restaurateur in Lowell. His name was John Tatsias. And John was a Bowdoin graduate who could quote any of the old Roman and Greek philosophers. He was extremely conservative. And I often would say to him, John, if I ever run for president, that you can be chair of the Fascist Vasongas Committee, which he was quite prepared to do. We would get into these ferocious arguments, and he loved Spiro Agnew. And my view and Michael Dukakis' view were quite different. We're the only two Greeks in politics who felt that way. Well, as you all know, Spiro Agnew came to naught when he was discovered with, how do I say it delicately, brown paper bags with green things inside. And it wasn't spinach or broccoli. And when that made the news, I found myself very hungry, and the only place I could think of to eat was John's restaurant. So I went down and I sat at the counter, and he was flipping the hamburgers and trying to ignore me. And I had this Cheshire cat grin on my face, and didn't say a word, just looked at him and smiled and smiled and smiled. And finally he took his apron off and threw it on the ground and came around the counter and sat next to me, and he said, "Paul, did you know that Agnew's mother was an Episcopalian?" Since I married an Episcopalian, I'm free to say that. It was, Spiro Agnew was not an accident. The Spiro Agnew who divided the country was pursuing a basic policy, divide and rule. And it worked. And ultimately in politics, the only criteria is who wins and who loses. George Bush has a more benign face, but it's the same policy. Divide and rule. Willie Horton. I would suggest, if you want to understand George Bush, that someday, some evening, you sit down all by yourself and imagine that you are George Bush, and they bring you the Willie Horton ad, and you watch that ad, and the question's raised, should we use it? Would you have used it? There's nobody in this audience that would raise their hand and say, yeah, I would have used it. And Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican. Can you imagine Abraham Lincoln sitting in a room, and in comes Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes and John Sununu? First of all, they wouldn't be working for him. But if by some mystery they happened to be working for him, he brought the ad in, played the ad, and said, Mr. Lincoln, should we use it? Does anybody think he would have said yes? He would have been outraged and fired them and said, that's not what this country's about. When George Bush used Willie Horton, he was a divider. You divide the country, and then you rule it. And that man should not be elected President of the United States again. This quota bill, it's no longer a quota bill. Why? Because they figured it out that they've already divided the country, and it's called David Duke. David Duke is the child of Willie Horton. When you do Willie Horton, this is what you end up with. If you divide the country, this is what you end up with. So they are living, they're reaping the rewards, quote unquote, the fruits of Willie Horton. They created this monster in terms of racial division, and now it's coming back and knocking on the front door. And George Bush is saying, I don't know you. Father, Father. Yes, son. I can't endorse you, son, but Father, you created me. That's George Bush. It takes a certain capacity to do that. Think of someone who was a supporter of Planned Parenthood, who migrates to a position of having advice to women ruled illegal. From Planned Parenthood to the gag rule on choice. Think of the journey. Think of that journey. And what kind of a man makes that journey? The man has no core. You cannot make that journey if there are a set of values that root you. It is ultimate cynicism. There is nothing worth fighting for. What does the Reagan right want? Give it to him. And the fact that there may be millions of women who pay the price, well, that's not important. Divide and rule is not a Republican-dominated technique. Democrats do it as well. And there are Democrats who are running in 1992 who do the same thing. They don't divide by race, they divide by class. And so the instinct is class warfare, populism. You take this country, you figure it out that there are more middle class and lower income than rich, you divide it, the rich go to them, we take everything else, we win. The problem with that is that's winning, it's not governing. And that is the equivalent of what George Bush is doing. Divide and rule is a primary strategy, it's a November strategy, it's not a January strategy. You end up, a la Robert Redford, getting sworn in and saying, now what do I do? There's no point being president of the United States if you cannot govern. And what 1992 has to be about is a mandate to govern. And the only way that's possible is if the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are prepared to say that divide and rule is no longer the modus operandi, that it is time to heal. It is time to understand the very basic concept that we are one team. And the only way we're going to survive in this world, in this competitive world, is as one functional team. Now, you think that George Bush, who recited the Pledge of Allegiance, right, in 1988 ad nauseum. When was the last time you saw him do it? It doesn't apply anymore? The words are different? One nation, under God, indivisible. He said it, but he didn't mean it. Or he said it, he didn't understand it. Indivisible. One nation. We are one people. And we will survive as one people, or we will not survive. And so in some respects, this is very Darwinian, that there is a justice to all of this. And nations which allow themselves to be separated will fall. Not in any cataclysm necessary, but it's certainly in a reduced standard of living because we don't have our act together. And so what 1992 is about is whether for the first time in a long time it's possible to take this country and understand that we're all part of one team and that we are linked as one team. And how any member of society does affects how the rest of us live. That's a long way from divide and rule, us, them. It's the opposite. I'll give you an example. In Massachusetts, people are very pleased with how Massachusetts is doing. By what standard? By what standard? My youngest child is in public school in Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell happens to be doing better than most cities. But all throughout this Commonwealth, there are children whose hope is being destroyed because they're in these classrooms with 40 kids. They have no culture, no art class, no gymnasium, nothing. And you've got a governor who I happen to respect on a lot of social issues who has no sense that destroying the educational system is not a legacy you ought to be proud of. And what is the economic policy of such a program? The old view is that if the elite did well, that you'd have trickle down, everybody else would live reasonably well. Well, in the world that we're now living in, the reverse is true. To survive in this national, international economy depends on the working class. If the working class is not better educated with higher skills than their counterparts, it all breaks down. So if the average worker in Taiwan the average worker in Korea, the average worker in Germany, the average worker in France is simply better educated with higher skills, that's where prosperity will reside. In those countries, those states, those cities that pull back on education will reap the benefits of that indecision, indiscretion, and poor judgment. So when I read in the newspapers that you have all these proposals in Massachusetts for educational reform, while there's no money, who are we kidding? And why are we so pleased? What the hell is the economic policy based on an educational system that's going to hell? Forget social values. Forget any humanist instincts. It is terrible economics. At some point, we are one team. And the sooner we recognize that, the better. A child in Roxbury who is not going to get a Head Start program because we put the money in Star Wars is going to have more to say about how we live than what's happening in the Soviet Union. A Star Wars program against whom? Are we worried that Estonia is going to invade Luxembourg? We must be. Let me finish with my view of this world in terms of economics. Everybody's running around saying the economy is not reviving. They lowered the interest rates, right? You all took economics. That's why I'm a dropout. You lower the interest rates, people invest. Well, they lower it, and they lower it, and they lower it, and they lower it. Nothing happens. And all these experts say, well, what's going on? I mean, why are they experts? It's like, who predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union? You have thousands of experts being paid all this money, and not one person predicted it. And they still experts? Of course they are. Why are they experts? Because they're experts. Nobody saw the greatest change in our time coming. Why isn't the economy doing well? And why isn't it going to do well? Because the engine isn't working. There is no consumer confidence. And why is that? Because there's nothing to be confident about. It's pretty basic. Why do you think the average person living in Massachusetts is not confident about the future? Because he or she is not sure they're going to be working and lives next door to somebody who isn't. So why incur debt to make purchases? Everybody's going to hunker down, and the survival instinct is what's at play here. Because the average American looks at what's happening to this economy and says, I don't have faith in the future. That's why the interest rates coming down don't have the effect. George Bush's attitude is, hey, if there's more to it, I'd love to hear it. And you can. The Democrats' approach is a middle-class tax cut. Now, there's a brilliant idea. We're broke, we're in debt, and I'm going to solve your problem by giving you a tax cut. You're going to get $300 per child. How am I going to pay for it? I'm going to borrow the money. From whom? From you. When I heard that, it reminded me of an earlier proposal that each child be worth $1,000 in a tax credit. And I was thinking, we're running for president, got all these fathers, and we'd all be up on the stage. And we were worth something like $17,000 in tax credits. Why? Because we fathered children. Now, that is certainly a good economic theory, if there ever was one. And where were we going to get the $17,000? We were going to borrow from our children. Now, that makes eminent good sense. That's why we're Democrats. We understand those things implicitly. Somebody, someday, is going to recognize that the time has come for economic reality and to put forth an economic program that's not the result of Packardell's polls. Every proponent of the middle-class tax cut is someone on a public salary. You think that's a coincidence? And all the economists who are opposed to it and those who are in business are on the private sector salary. That is a remarkable coincidence. If those who believe in it don't work in the private sector, where is the gaggle of economists clamoring for a middle-class tax cut? Where are they? They don't exist. If they don't exist, why is it possible to have politicians in Washington clamoring for it? It's called polls. It's not economics. There is no economic hope if there's not rationality. And the American people are not stupid. They understand that if you borrow money from me to give me a tax cut, that I pay the money eventually. My economic program is very simple. And I was supposed to bring with me today the copy of the MIT report. Now, that's allowed, right, to talk about MIT? Yeah. I'm not an MIT dropout. I was never invited in. So it's the MIT report that came out a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It talked about the American economy, had in it the sentence that I think is the fundamental reality facing America today. And the sentence is very simple. In order to live well, you must produce well. And as far as I'm concerned, that's it. If you don't have a vibrant, competitive manufacturing sector, everything else falls. In order to live well, you must produce well. The American economic policy has to be geared fundamentally to making this a country that has a manufacturing base that is competitive, produces quality products, and exports those products, period. If the manufacturing sector is doing well, then the service sector will do fine because it feeds off manufacturing. If people are laid off by digital, are they going to buy homes with what? Are they going to go skiing in New Hampshire and Vermont with what? Are the banks going to be in trouble? Of course they are, because values are imploding. The only way to give economic hope to the American people is to give them common sense. This country must have a viable, competitive, thriving, triumphant manufacturing sector, period. If we do that, the quality of life in this country will survive and will do fine. If we don't have it, then we will suffer the fate of every nation that lost the capacity to have an engine which drives the economy and which provides high salaries, which then provides the wherewithal for people to provide for their families. So the economic hope that I provide in this campaign is not that I'm pro-business. I am pro-business. It's not that I'm pro-private sector. I am pro-private sector. Nothing else works. And a democratic economic program based on a kind of latter-day public works project has a fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy works. You think by having more bridges built, and I'm for that, it's going to make us competitive with Japan? Does anybody believe that? And that's what we're talking about. Capital gains tax cut, investment tax credits, change in antitrust laws, all of that which is in this booklet, which I think That's what we're talking about, a capacity to make this country competitive and provide the quality of life that we can be proud of, and when we give it to our children, not feel guilty that we've taken this great treasure and reduced it to debt. That is the Reagan-Bush legacy. That's why Democrats have a historic and moral obligation to offer something better. And that's why George Bush's numbers are falling, because people are scared stiff, and they have a right to be scared stiff. And if we don't give them hope based on reality, we don't deserve to be the opposition party. But I'm confident we're going to do it. Look at the list of Democratic candidates for president. It's a remarkably interesting group. There are no traditionalists in this group. You may think we're crazy, but we're interesting. I think it's a great group of people, and I hope it'll be expanded. And I think we're going to finally have a Democratic Party that is pro-economic growth, pro-civil rights, pro-gay rights, pro-environment, pro-women's rights, pro-choice, and all the other things that are the heart and soul of our party, and understand fundamentally that you cannot redistribute wealth you never created. No goose, no golden eggs. If you're pro-jobs, you sure as hell better be pro-private sector. Wed those two, and George Bush vanishes. And finally, this country says to itself, we're tough enough, we're strong enough, we've got what it takes. Do away with the happy talk, do away with the avoidance, and let's be what our ancestors were, tough enough to do the job. Thank you.
Senator Tsongas has graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience. We have a microphone here and one here as well. I'd just like to remind people to please keep their questions to short questions and not statements.
It is very well and good to argue against divide and conquer types of politics. But what happens if, let's say, in 1992 you're the presidential nominee and we have the Jesse Helms quota commercial or Willie Horton Jr. commercials? How would you respond?
Two responses, if I could. One is, you better, when you're the nominee, you should have already filmed your response. So when you get hit, the next day they get hit back. I think that's a lesson from not only 1988, but every campaign that's ever been waged, that if you're talking about Roger Ailes, you're not talking about Mother Teresa. And a president who would follow the advice of a Roger Ailes is Roger Ailes with a nicer face. And you better understand that there is no core. Anything is possible, anything is forgivable, anything is justifiable. You better have your response already filmed, ready to go on. And you have to hit back just as hard as you've been hit. That's number one. Secondly, I think the media has no reason to feel good about itself from '88. Fact is, it got away with Willie Horton and the Pledge of Allegiance and Read My Lips. I mean, that was a hell of a mandate. They got away with it. And in a democracy, the press has a role to play. And what I think you're going to see happen in '92 is that the press is going to have a higher standard imposed on itself than what was true in '88. And you saw that in 1990, when you had all these Senate and House races and gubernatorial races. When an ad went on television, if you look at what happened here in Boston in the Weld Silber fight, every time somebody put an ad on, the Herald and the Globe on the next day did an analysis of those ads. So the idea of a hit and run is no longer possible. And I think you're going to see a lot of suggestions on debates, those kinds of things. So I think there's more of a safety net in terms of the press's view of itself. I mean, when the schools of journalism do seminars on the high watermark of American journalism, 88 campaign ain't going to be there. They understand that. And I think there is a wanting to right the wrong, or wanting for their own self-respect. And so I'm very hopeful in that respect, but we're going to film those ads anyway, in case I'm wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the reasons of our industrial decline has been the industrial policies and targeting of our industries by our trading partners. And in response to that, should we develop our own industrial policies, especially for high-tech industries like semiconductors and aircraft?
I'm not a believer in picking winners and losers, but the fact is that you can invest in strategic technologies, the pre-production, pre-commercial application of these kinds of technologies. Some of them are going to work, some are not. But to get beyond that stage and say this industry will invest in this one, we won't, I would back off from that. One area that I would put a lot of emphasis on is reciprocity. The Japanese are often accused of taking advantage of us. That's right. And the reason they take advantage of us is very simple. We let them. Ronald Reagan would go to the Japanese and say, look, we are against the Soviets. They are the evil empire. We want you to support us against the Soviets, and you can have everything else. They said, thank you very much, Mr. President. And they took it. Lee Iacocca said it the best. You cannot blame the Japanese for taking what we gave to them. And we have to turn to our trading partners and say, level playing field. What's good for us is good for you. And they've gotten away with murder all these years because we've allowed them. That's not to say, however, that the reason they sell cars in this country is they build damn good cars. And I used to own a Ford Pinto. And I also owned a Chevy Vega. You know, I am guilty as sin for falling into the trap of believing that you buy American and somehow God benefits you from that experience. We have to look at ourselves. We're the problem, too. And we have to build quality products. It's a very complicated puzzle. Build better products, open up their markets, invest in strategic technologies, provide a capital base, capital gains tax cut, investment tax credits, those kinds of things. But ultimately, we're simply stronger as a country. We have more natural resources than any other country. We have the best university system. And we have a unique combination of people with enormous skills. What we don't have is leadership and a plan. And that's what a presidential campaigns are about.
My question actually sort of relates to what you just finished with there. That is, at the beginning of your speech, you said that you think that Americans are going to vote, and this election will be decided on what candidate offers economic prosperity. I guess the essence of my question is whether or not you think that that is what Americans should be voting on. I guess what I'm thinking sort of behind this is that, as you point out, MIT can produce an economic report that says what we should do with the economy. And perhaps we should be looking for more than that from a president. And secondly, whether or not arguing or campaigning an election based on who's going to offer prosperity doesn't do some of what you criticize others for, appealing to people's fears or the sort of divide and rule on the basis of class, say, I'm the candidate who's going to improve your personal income, so you should vote for me. Is that the way this campaign should go? Is that the way people should be voting? And what can you do if you don't think that that's so?
My view of the election is, think of the country divided into three parts, like Gaul. Okay? First part is their constituency. The David Duke, anti-choice, that kind of right-wing Reagan constituency. We Democrats should forget about it. Every ounce of energy spent trying to bring them over is a waste of time. You can't do it without losing your soul. Okay? Then the other third is our third. Happen to be people care about choice. They think that is a fundamental American right, and George Bush sold his soul. It was a Faustian bargain. And one of the results of the Clarence Thomas Nita Hill hearings is that now is well understood. You have environmentalists. George Bush is the environmental president. It is an oxymoron. To allow global warming to go unattended is immoral. There are enough people who understand that. Remember, he said at his campaign, there will be no diminution of wetlands while I'm president. He was right. You changed the regulations of what a wetlands is. So that's part of our constituency as well. The gay community. I mean, gay rights is for 1991, 1992, what choice was back 20 years ago. It's the real test of where people, whether liberals or not, in my judgment. And you can add civil rights. You know, the recent decision to go with civil rights has not overcome Willie Horton. And anyone who is a person of color instinctively knows that someone who used Willie Horton has those instincts. It will not be comfortable. So that's our constituency. We ought to be proud of it, hang on to it, and embrace it. The other people in the middle are people who basically share our instincts on these liberal social issues and who fear for their livelihood. You're not offering them economic prosperity, you're offering them economic survival. What they're concerned about is not can I buy a BMW. What they're concerned about, can I provide for my family? Can I have a job? It's a survival instinct. It's not a prosperity instinct. And the reason what happens is these people who are liberal in their instincts, in my judgment, they're not racist. They're not anti-feminist. They look at George Bush and Ronald Reagan, look at that economic record and say, this is not working. Then they turn and look at us and are horrified and go back. I spoke in June to the Harvard Business School 5th reunion. Now that is certainly a pinko group, if there ever was one, right? I mean, these are his people. And there are about 80 people in the room, half Democrat, half Republican. I said to them, how many of you believe that George Bush has us on a path of economic viability? They just wanted to get a sense of who I was talking to. Not one raised their hand. Not one person of those 80 people raised their hand. And I said, well, how many of you think the Democrats have a plan for economic viability? Before I could finish the question, they burst into laughter. And in my view, that 2 minutes describes American politics. People know this guy has no idea where to take us. And they look at the opposition and they look at us. It's like Halloween. and they go screaming into the night. We will win if when they turn, they look at us and they see hope, rationality, common sense, truth. I know that's very undemocratic, but why don't we try it? We've lost 5 of the last 6 elections. And if we don't, we can, all right, why don't we do this? We'll win, see what it feels like. If you don't like it, we can go back and be Democrats again.
Senator, during the spring I was at a symposium you spoke at Dartmouth College on heroism, and you spoke about one of your heroes being Anwar Sadat. And my question's simple. Do you see any heroes tonight in Madrid at the peace conference?
There is no, in my judgment, Anwar Sadat equivalent. You're talking about an extraordinary human being. and a human being who understood, I'm not on this earth forever. And part of what life is about is responsibility. And did something that no one predicted, and he gave his life for. And so when people ask me, who's your hero, I always choose him. I met him right after he came back from Jerusalem. And I was doing a trip into Ethiopia and Sudan and Somalia at the time as a congressman. And I and Don Bonker met with him. And I don't know how to express this very well, but I was in the room with him. I felt I was in the room with something else, something greater than just human beings. This enormous sense of being at peace with himself that you could almost touch it. And I've never had that experience again, ever. And that's why I have a particular feeling for him. I think anybody who's at that conference is a hero or heroine of some dimension. Whether in that conference the chemistry allows them to reach above themselves and come to an accommodation, only time will tell. But it's almost a case where you have to let it go and be viewed by history, not by your contemporaries. Whether that many people can do that is a Hassad, a Sadat, not in my judgment, but let's give them the chance to do that. I think the whole process is very worthwhile. My own view is eventually you'll have peace in the Middle East only if you have a Middle Eastern common market. That you tie these countries together economically so they have a self-interest in each other. As long as you have this, which is what you have now, you're talking about extraordinary statesmanship to bridge the gap. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm hopeful. But I think if you had a common market between them so that they have a self-interest in each other, that's where you have the hope.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. I think a lot of what George Bush's emphasis on, besides foreign policy, is on where Republicans and will keep the economy getting better and making money. So his big thing is also the economy. And in your big thing that you're running on is to improve the economy. I just wanted to say that I think that your campaign would sound bigger and more positive if this country needs to get moving again in a positive direction. They take polls that say, what percentage of people think we're on the right track or wrong track? Like 78% say we're on the wrong track. So all I'm saying is I would like to see you talking about education from young to the college-age people, for education for people not going to college, who are going to work in the manufacturing, or like they do in West Germany. Education about the morals of this country. The morals in this country, a lot of it's too much freedom in terms of, well, whatever. The morals in this country have gone down the last 50 years. Education, morals, what else? Just basically, we all have to work together because George Bush basically is negative. I mean, he's up there and he's like a negative president. He goes off and does some foreign policy things, but he's not caring for people. I mean, and so when you talk about getting our economy moving also, that's good, but George Bush talks about the rich people making money. I think you should talk more about maybe the government working more with some companies or whatever to get the average guy to make more. So I'd like to see a wider emphasis besides just the economic when you talk. That's my opinion.
I hope when you leave that you have a copy of this?
I don't have one, no. I'll just say that most of the time when we talk about economics, but I think this country needs to move in a positive direction. There's a lot of other things which people have to start working together on.
Let me say that your point is well taken. The reason I wanted to give you this was the first chapter is on economics, the second or third is on education. I have said that if I had only one thing to spend money on, it would be Head Start. Because I think the viability of our children is the fundamental building block to economic change. The other reason is that the last chapter in here is a chapter on culture. In my home city of Lowell, and there should be an article in the Wall Street Journal about this in the near future. I've been interviewed by Lowell, Massachusetts has the best public art collection, modern public art collection, of any city of its size in the country. And the reason we did that was because Lowell is a working class city. I grew up there and I lived there. We wanted to have some capacity to expose children to culture. So it wasn't just a Merrimack Repertory Theater, but that a child in a Cambodian family, in a black family, in a Greek family, you name it, walking to school can walk past a piece of sculpture and look up and see it and hopefully be touched by it. That, in my judgment, the ultimate test of a society is the strength of its culture. And what we haven't come to grips with in this country is what is our culture. You know, you talk about, during the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, and I was home watching that. If you change channels and watch the ads, the beer ads, and what they were doing and what they were selling, and you wonder why you have issues like sexual harassment, the culture is giving values to our children that are not sustainable. And part of what's trouble with Democrats is we don't know how to talk about this. We don't know how to talk about values and mean it. Bill Clinton's doing it. I think it's great. You know, and Democrats are afraid of spirituality. Like somehow God registered as a Republican.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing, is that a lot of times Republicans say that, you know, they're very close to spirituality, and I think Democrats should express their own religiousness more often.
Well, I think you know, to recognize that there's a larger reality is not partisan. And any party that has Jesse Helms and David Duke and Roger Ailes, I don't know what spirituality that is, but it ain't mine.
This will be our final question for the evening.
Question? Okay. This is also going to be an economic type question. I listen to George Bush, and I hear, don't worry, be happy. I hear you this evening, and I think I gather that I heard we're going to suffer. I mean, we basically, in order to get back ahead of things in the world, in order to be competitive. Now, Mr. President Bush has also endorsed the capital gains cut, and I'm sure he wants to change the antitrust laws. I don't know about the investment tax cut, but I also hear George Bush say no new taxes. Does that mean I can inculcate that you are going to raise taxes or cut programs? And I'd like to ask you, which programs would you cut? How high would you raise taxes? And is this how we're going to suffer as an electorate?
Not bad. Not bad. You know, I've said this before, but there's an old expression in politics: if you take questions, you will invariably stay one question too long. I don't suppose there's I don't need a blackboard. I need something to write on to answer that question. Is there anything quickly gottenable? I mean, maybe I can just take your yellow sheet there.
Sure.
Okay. This will do. It's my introduction, so it's it can be recycled. Anybody have a marker pen that you could see from a distance? Anything, if you have anything thicker, it might be helpful. The richest university in the world, and I can't get a magic marker. If you built it, he will come. If you complain loud enough, it'll eventually happen.
We're getting there.
This is doomed not to be an answered question. Here we go. Okay. I don't mean to write over Harvard, but as a former Yale trustee, this is a thrill. I'm going to have to do it on here, then show it to you. George Bush's capital gains tax cut is nonsense. You want a more technical?
Right. Well, yeah, that would be nice than just calling it nonsense, because how would you distinguish your capital gains cut?
I'm going to do that for you now.
Thank you.
That's not an L, that's a chart. The top line is the capital gains tax today. The bottom line is what George Bush is proposing. So if you invest in capital, you get a capital gains tax cut, period. And that's the George Bush capital gains tax cut. Okay? This is mine. The horizontal line is the tax rate today, and the diagonal line is what I would recommend. And the difference is that on the top, you would get a capital gains tax cut if you invest in real estate, if you invest in an art collection, if you invest in a horse farm. Under mine, you would get nothing if you did that. My capital gains tax cut would be targeted to securities. What I'm trying to do is to get money into those companies trying to survive out there. So mine is a targeted capital gains tax cut. Okay?
Okay.
So, number one. Secondly, the diagonal is a line that says if you are a speculator, you'll pay a higher tax. And if you hold it long enough, you'll pay a lower tax. George Bush's capital gains tax has nothing to do with patience. It rewards Ivan Boesky. My capital gains tax cut says I want not capital, I want patient capital. So if you are a speculator, I'm going to charge you for being a speculator. And if you hold it long enough, that's when your capital tax rate comes down. There's not an economist in the world who will tell you that the top one is better than the bottom one. And finally, George Bush's capital gains tax cut is paid for by debt. My capital gains tax cut is paid for by a third-tier income tax. And the argument that Democrats use against the capital gains tax is that the wealthy benefit. That is a traditional Democratic view. Rather than saying, does it work, they say, who benefits? And if the rich benefit, then we're opposed to it, even if it helps the country. My view is, if it works, you do it. Then the issue comes up of fairness. So, who gets the money from a capital gains tax cut? The wealthy. Who should pay for it? The wealthy. So, between wealthy, middle class, and lower income, you have the same ratio. Nobody benefits. Within the wealthy category, those who invest in America benefit, and those that don't, don't. So you get past the issue of fairness. You have the capital gains tax cut. It is targeted to securities. It is patient capital, and it's paid for by the same class that benefits from it. That's not very difficult. George Bush, this at the top is an ideology. It's not an economic policy. The Democrats' approach is we're not for it because it benefits the wealthy is the equivalent.
So you would recommend a tax-neutral approach?
A tax-neutral,
so how would
targeted.
How would that close, let's say, the deficit, or were you?
It has no effect on the deficit,
Right.
except that you
How
then
would you
have
do that?
the capital pool to get your engine running again, which then provides your revenue source. The point you're getting to about the deficit, well, what is the Reagan approach to the deficit and the Bush approach? More is better, right?
Well, they also had the trickle down.
Can you imagine being president of the United States? You've been vice president. When you took office, the American debt was less than $1 trillion. It's going to be $4 trillion at the end of next year. So you did more with your friend, Mr. Reagan, than all the presidents from Washington to Carter put together by threefold. And you support the Balanced Budget Amendment. That's like Bonnie and Clyde coming out for gun control. Right? You can hear the words. If they don't nauseate you, it's your fault. Now, my view of how you deal with the budget deficit is a freeze. If you have another introduction? What you have today is a revenue line in the bottom that's going up, but you have an expenditure line that's going up faster. That's Reaganomics. Reaganomics, by the way, is Keynesian. Reagan was a pure Keynesianist. You cut taxes, you spend widely, this time in defense, you stimulate the economy, and so you have massive growth, and you get all this debt. Pure Keynesian economics. It wasn't Arthur Laffer, although Laffer thought he had the right name for his... When those two lines diverge, which is what's happening, one of the effects of that are high interest rates long term. Because everybody with half a brain knows that with all this debt and all the crowding out, there's going to be such demand for money that interest rates long term will be high. So that's why you have this anomaly of a situation where interest rates are very high compared to what's happening short term. The only way you can deal with this is to freeze it. To take the budget of the United States and freeze the damn thing. Now, normally you could not do that because you'd have to fund the Cold War. But a funny thing happened on the way to economic Armageddon. Gorbachev showed up. And Gorbachev figured out for his country the same basic reality. They were going to hell in a handbasket, and they had to pull back. And so the result of the Berlin Wall coming down is that we can cut back on defense, freeze the budget, take some of the money out of defending Europe, for example, put it into Head Start, AIDS research, those kinds of things, the National Science Foundation, and have an economic plan while still dealing with the deficit.
So you would also freeze entitlements?
I think some entitlements, for example, should have a...
Social Security, Medicare?
Should have a means test. Anyway, presuming that these will be of great worth someday, you're invited to. Thank you very much.